Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Lenko Show. If you've listened before, thank you very much. I did record a little moment in my previous podcast about reaching 2,500 views. And the reason for that is I don't normally give myself a little pat on the back about things, and I don't normally appreciate kind of achievements and or even things that I've done in a great light. To me, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but I sat back and I thought about, do you know what? I'm actually quite pleased with that, considering I've not actually put a lot of effort into necessarily promoting the podcast. So it was quite a pleasant surprise. Anyway, cracking on with today's show, we're going to get stuck straight into this because the other week I asked for a couple of questions. I put myself open to a Q&A via my Instagram profile. And I've had quite a few questions. I had quite a few questions sent through. I responded to every single one of them privately. And I just wanted to kind of break down a couple of those questions, which are going to account for the next few podcast episodes. So we're going to kind of take one question at a time. I'm doing that in the hope that it makes it more efficient for you to actually find this episode. You get the precise and detailed information you're looking for if indeed you're searching for that particular thing. And then you can move on. You can choose whether to listen to the next one or not. So this episode, we are going to dig in to the best way to train / improve speed. All right. Big topic. Thanks, Terrell. Terrell sent that in. Now, I've set myself kind of like a strict timeline for this. I don't really want to go over 15 minutes, but we'll see what happens because once I get going, and especially if I end up on a tangent, you never know where we might end up. So I'm going to try and break this down into some more simplified, structured suggestions for you. And, because it's such a broad question, I can't just say, right, this is the way. Like I have a set of fundamental principles that I look towards when I'm thinking about as a sports coach, as a fitness coach, how can I get this person faster? It always depends on a couple of other variables. So I'm going to kind of break down a couple of things and add in some main principles that are definitely applicable to everybody. And then you can find where you are, you can figure it out yourself and either adapt it, add it into your own training, or if you want, you can also come and work with me. You can send me a message, ask me to provide you with a bit of help with your training. I have no problems with doing that. I can work with you online, remotely, or even in person if you dare. So, and also if you can travel to Manchester, that's kind of a fundamental key thing to it until I have a number of coaches working with me as well. Anyway, first off, what you're going to do for training for speed is you need to set aside 2 to 3 sessions per week where speed is going to be your focus. It's going to be a fundamental objective of the session. Now, in these sessions, you need to first and foremost manage the workload and build your tolerance to being able to continuously apply speed as quickly as power and apply force as fast and as powerfully as possible and as much force as possible, because that's ultimately what speed is going to be. Now, that involves training in a very different way to the way that most of us like to train, or the way that most of us like to feel when we train, or as a result of training. I'm thinking about this from a perspective of, we all want to look pretty jacked. We all want to look solid, robust, lean, athletic. And the way that you train for speed, like whenever you train for speed, because you're looking at the specific outcome and the physiological output, there comes a point where you're not necessarily tired, or you might not feel tired, but you might be slowing down. And that is when it's important to stop. Because if you were to look at similar training styles, whether it's or opposing training styles, whether you go and do CrossFit or bodybuilding and you're aiming to get a pump, or you want to be dripping with sweat or you want to be blowing and absolutely gassed through your lungs, that is a very, very different training outcome than what we're necessarily looking for with speed. So speed is all about quality, it's all about performance, and it's all about that output. So if you can measure your output through your speed sessions, that's going to put you at an advantage, whether it involves having someone stood at the side with a stopwatch timing your 30 or 40 meter sprints. That can be very useful. You can see the point at which you begin to drop off, and you know when to check out, you know when to cash in, you know when to walk away, start your recovery. The other kind of catch 22 on that, and I have done this before, and I kind of figured this out whilst training a few people, and especially with athletes and competitive people by nature, kids, they all want to know their time. They all want to strain to be faster. They want to stress themselves out. And that's not necessarily the way to do it. If you're tightening up and you're stretching every sinew to gain that output, quite often that can end up slowing you down. So if you to think about this, if you were to contract your quads and your hamstrings at the same time, your knee joint is solid, it's not going anywhere. You need to be able to contract and relax at the appropriate speed. You need to be able to work those patterns, work that rhythm in tandem, and the muscles have got to switch on and off and on and off in a cooperative fashion. And if you start trying to force that, you're going to begin to slow it down and lock yourself up and ultimately pull yourself further away from your goal. So you need to be slinky, you need to be loose, you need to be relaxed. And that's where your power is going to come from. So first principle, train it 2 to 3 times per week. Now, that might be like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Your Friday, if you're a footballer, I know I speak to a lot of footballers, and that's my main clientele, is if you're playing on the Saturday, your Friday session can simply be a neural priming session. So you might do a couple of 30-meter sprints. You might do some 10-meter accelerations. You might have a bit of a circuit where you're working on some power exercises like underhand med ball throws, kettlebell swings, box jumps, hard, fast push-ups, various different throws. And again, you're looking to get out of there before you fatigue, before you start slowing down. That's efficient speed work. That is very good. That's a very, very good use of your time, your efforts, and your energy without making you tired, without making you sore, without making you stiff for the next day. You're exciting your nervous system, which is where all this force and all this power is going to come from. And ultimately moving yourself closer towards your goal. And that's a really, really, I'm sure I've spoken about it on this podcast, previous episodes. Well, that is a must. That is a must. The day before a game, not just to get you the best performance out of yourself on that day in that game, but also to build your tolerance to increased workload and ultimately work your tendon strength and fundamental movement patterns again and again and again to build your tolerances and resistance to injury and compromised positions. I spoke in my last episode about some of England's fast bowlers in cricket consistently being injured. Obviously, spending a lot of time in the gym. I don't know exactly what they're doing, but you have to be applying yourself in that movement and working fast. You have to build your tolerance and allow your fascia and your body systems to adapt. And this is where it comes into balance. I'll talk about it with the relationship that has between strength training, muscle building, and increased power sort of like later on, because increasing strength is one of the key components, but I'm not going to go into that just yet. So the next thing that we're going to work on, and you can do this at any point in time, in terms of those 2 or 3 sessions per week, maybe more if you want. You can always, no matter how you feel, no matter how stiff, sore, tired you are, you can always be drilling one of the following. These link into the 5 Ps. I've recorded a YouTube video on this in the past whilst going through some acceleration drills. You're going to work on your posture, the positioning of your joints, getting the angles correct. You're going to work on the movement pattern. Again, I've spoken about the relationship between muscles contracting and relaxing, like in a bit of a as part of a whole system. The entire thing is linked. Making sure that you're utilizing the correct muscles to drive certain movements, your glutes to be the prime mover of hip extension rather than your lower back or your hamstrings. They should just be helping out. Then the placement of foot contact to floor. Ultimately, combine all of those aspects with the result of optimal power. And I think that this kind of relates to another coach who I've seen a bit from. And I think training methods, very big on eccentric isometrics. Don't know whether he's trying to make that a thing, but from what I can figure out, it's literally tempo training. And if you were really going to be literal about it, it's an eccentric, isometric with a concentric component. So it's just a movement. It's just another exercise. It's no different to the way that most people train anyway. The only emphasis is going to be on the slow lowering, pause at the bottom, and then accelerate the weight. Like it's, and here's the fundamental thing. You can do all of these exercises. You can work to your 90-degree joint angles, whatever you want. You can do that while squatting. You can do it whilst balancing in a lunge position on a Bosu ball with an elephant on your shoulders. And you can fancy it up. You can attach bands, chains, whatever the hell you want. You can hang something from your ear if you need to, but that's not necessarily going to translate across into the specific movement pattern which you're trying to get faster at. So training in one particular way doesn't necessarily maximize the mechanics of the skill you're trying to be quicker at. Okay, so hopefully you follow that. So you can do the fanciest, weirdest looking squats you want, but that doesn't necessarily put you in the position to be better at sprinting. To be better at sprinting, you need to break down the technique. The same goes with change of direction. The same goes with agility. The same goes with reactive impulses and reactive movements in sport. You have to break down the technique, get your posture right, get your positioning correct, get the movement patterns organized. I think that's a very, very appropriate word to describe the movement patterns. You want to organize everything so it's in sync and that you can get your foot placements correct on the floor to give you the best chance of pushing off in the most efficient manner possible. So we're talking about, can you change 3 steps and do it in 2? Can you cover the same distance in just 2 steps without compromising your body angles or your positioning? I'm talking about, can you do it in 2 steps and still be under control to be able to move again? Again, I've spoken countless times that the main component of being fast in field sports is the ability to accelerate, decelerate, change direction, reaccelerate, and continuously do that, continuously work through it. So you have to practice the specific thing you are trying to be faster at. Now, if you were to look at the physique, the build, the power, the strength, and the stability of most sprint track athletes, the vast majority of their time and effort and energy is spent on sprinting. So you could argue that working speed and just aiming to move fast in the first place actually helps develop strength. I would suggest that that is quite possibly correct. Seeing the way that some of these guys can just walk into a weight room and power clean like 140 kilos without necessarily even spending hours and hours and hours in the weight room practicing weightlifting, they've naturally developed that explosiveness and the ability to shift that weight that quickly. So this is where we talk about the strength speed curve in sport quite a lot, and we're always aiming to shift that curve. I think fundamentally, and I've probably been guilty of this myself in the past, there is always a bias towards the strength work, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It can result in a lot of robustness, but you need to dial up the speed work. And I think that's generally due to the nature in which gyms have been built, the way that gyms have been designed. If you go into a local kind of leisure center, commercial gym, fitness club, health club, even most CrossFit gyms, where it's just a warehouse space and there's a rig and nuts and bolts, barbells everywhere, the bare bones and basics of strength training. Very rarely will you have a sprint track, somewhere to run, somewhere to jump, somewhere to bound. Yeah, most places have got the plyo box cube things now for jumping up to, but I mean, most people bastardize those in the first place anyway. So we can't just rely on that as a source of speed work. So the way to tailor, or being able to tailor, for you to be able to tailor your training towards speed has kind of been negated or taken away from you by the simple design of most of these training facilities. So essentially what I'm saying is, like, you want to get a lot of your speed work done out on the training pitch, out on the field, and in a space on a track where you can run. You have to be able to run. You have to be able to jump. You need to be able to bound. You've got to have the spaces to do these movements. And this is the next thing I want to get into with you. So a couple of the key movements, but I'm just going to simplify it into three, really. I want you to be able to jump, and broad jump would translate better into that horizontal force production, i.e. traveling forwards. So speed, as opposed to vertical. Obviously, if you wanted to jump high, you do plenty of vertical jumping. Not to say that the two can't necessarily affect each other, but if you were to get real down into the specifics, that's what I'd go for. So jump, standing broad jump, multiple broad jumps joined together where you're literally rolling from one jump to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. Bounding, whether it's which is essentially, like, let's be honest, bounding is jumping from one leg to the other, left to right, left to right, left to right. Or you can go single leg bounding, which is essentially long distance hopping. Start to join those repetitions together. And what we're talking about when we're doing these things, and well, I'll go into my third choice and the final one to really nail these home for you first. Your last one is to run, sprint. By sprint or run, I mean travel as fast as you physically can. Distances 20 to 40 meters. If you're looking at being more of a track athlete or working more of the speed maintenance and being able to carry that speed on for the duration of either 100 or 200 meters, you can start to extend those. But for most field sport athletes, you're not really going to sprint more than 30 meters. So working within those confines and within that kind of frame, if you like, that's where I'd say, maybe stretch the top speed work to 40 meters. Wouldn't necessarily go much more than that. Now, where was I? What was I talking? I was going to break down into components of bounding, I think. That's it. So when we're talking about bounding, sprinting, jumping, doing all of these components together, we're essentially not necessarily training the musculature, but we're looking at a deeper, and this is kind of like a little bit more out there, and not many people touch on this, but we're looking at training the fascia within the body. And I'm gonna dig in deeper to fascial lines and the way that it transmits force in future episodes, because I'm going to be honest, I don't fully understand it all yet. I think yet's probably sounding a bit too naive. I don't necessarily think we've even scratched the surface as coaches and trainers when it comes to fascia and the relationship that has in transmitting force and speed through the body. So if you to look at when you sprint, most of the time, once you hit the ground at that moment of peak force, your muscles are contracting isometrically. They're not moving. They are essentially locked in, and all that force is going through tendons, through your fascia, and like ultimately, I don't even know how to begin to start necessarily explaining this to you in the right way. So I'm not actually going to go too deep into that today because whilst I think I understand it in my own head, I would probably be a little bit daft for me to try and explain it to you and try and give you sound understanding of it just yet. So hold on to that one. Look out for that in future episodes. So ultimately, like, here we go. I'm gonna end up giving it a go now. Think of fascia as like the web that connects everything under your skin together. All right, it's like the the bits in between that kind of encapsulate all your muscle fibers, your organs, and then like the gel-like substance that flows through everything else. You've constantly got fibroblasts working away like a slug leaving a trail of slime. And then that slime will then kind of adapt to the forces it has been exposed to. It can either become stiffer and tenser, i.e., if you have been jumping or sprinting and applying tons of force very, very quickly, it's going to become stiff. It's going to become very, very fibrous. It's going to allow for more force and effort to be put through there. However, if you're going to be very, very kind of flexible, it's going to become a little more elastic. It's going to become a little stretchier. And we can change that. We can adapt that based on the training that we do. So lots of force applied very, very quickly. Train your fascia. Don't necessarily just focus on muscle strength or size because that is quite likely to lead to more injuries. And the more we can spend time training movement patterns at speed and with a bit of force, especially while younger, we can become more adapted. I think this is a personal opinion based on what I see, based on what I've read. I think we can become more suited to high level sport, training and playing at speed by actually doing those things whilst we're young and whilst we're developing. So whilst we're little humans running around, and I suppose I've never really been big on kind of the understanding as to why kids shouldn't do plyometric work. Now, I think, yes, there is a limit, there is a level of safety in which you need to be mindful of, especially when they hit peak height velocity as an adolescent. However, saying that younger athletes shouldn't do plyometric training, what are you saying that they shouldn't learn to run? They shouldn't learn to jump? They shouldn't sprint? They shouldn't be, because if you're going to go by that definition, they shouldn't be playing any sport whatsoever. So we're just going to wrap them up in cotton wool, wait for them to grow up. And then once they've grown up, once they've gone through their adolescence and they're into their more senior form, that's when we're going to start training them. No, not buying that. Absolute nonsense. As a kid, learn to run, learn to jump, learn to change direction, move in all sorts of different ways, learn to solve problems, move from compromised positions, kneeling, lying down, one leg, landing on one leg, changing direction. Learn to do all those things from a very, very young age. And even if you haven't done those things yet and you're an adult, start now. Start doing that. Learn to land, learn to jump, learn to change direction, practice them, have a play around with them. And this is where sports mini games can be very, very useful because you can develop those practices. The emphasis is it has to be done at speed for you to maximize speed training. So coaches, and I know there are a lot of, say, amateur or even semi-pro football coaches that go, right, well, we need to be faster. So they'll add in loads of sprint conditioning into training sessions, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 60 seconds work, 3-minute games, 6-minute games, 9-minute games. That's not speed conditioning. Speed conditioning, you need to be a lot more precise, a lot kind of lower on the repetition scale and a lot more on the rest times. So be mindful of that. Like don't just throw everything at the athletes, at the players, at the team. and trust that some of it's going to stick. Not the best way to do it. So I would suggest add in components and skilled components for those fundamental P's, the position, posture, pattern, and placement. Add things like that into your warm up where you're teaching them the correct joint angles, you're showing them how to move efficiently, and let them go, let them practice it. And then hopefully you will, well, you should start, say, hopefully, we're talking about hoping that things stick, and I'm hoping. Once you've kind of drilled those things again and again, you should start to see them stick when it comes to game scenarios and small-sided games working in tight spaces. So we've gone through 2-3 times a week. You're working your position, posture, pattern, power, or position, posture, pattern, placement to gain and generate more power. You're going to do 3 key things. You're going to jump, you're going to bound, you're going to sprint. You're going to move fast and vary your movement patterns. The next thing we're going to look at is how heavy are you? Have you got any excess non-contractile body mass? By that, I mean, are you a bit fat? If that is indeed the case, I am not going to have a go at you. Fat is required, weight is required for multiple positions in various different sports. Linemen in American football being a prime example. Sumo wrestlers in Japan, well, say Japan, around the world, if that is indeed a thing. I'm not sure there's any sumo wrestling in the UK, but anyway, sumo wrestling, those guys need to be big. They need to be immovable. They need a bit more kind of excess fat mass than most other people, but they're also extremely powerful. For field sports, if you can get rid of some of that non-contractile mass, that excess body fat, and work on being a little bit lighter. So if you can increase your strength and your speed in certain positions, certain movement patterns, the lighter you are and the more force you can apply, ultimately you've worked both ends of that spectrum. So you should see those distances, those times start to improve. So have a look at yourself, have a look at that. How lean are you? What's your body fat percentage? What are the requirements of your sport? Chip away at that if necessary. A really good test of that is I really like the pull-up test, and just how many, well, obviously as a physical test as opposed to just kind of skin fold caliper measurements, or jumping in a bod pod or that kind of thing. Yes, you can do that. You can work out your body fat percentage, but once you've done that, see how many pull-ups you can get. If you're generally really, really strong, but you can't get many pull-ups, you know you've got a lot of excess weight, and you could do with dropping that off. And again, that's the reason I say I include this as an exercise, because it's probably going to appear as an exercise in most training sessions as a full body movement, being able to pull and hold your own body weight. You're going to get a regular exposure to your like rough result or the feeling of that. So pull-up test, drop your body fat, and then like the last kind of key thing, which I touched on earlier, is increase your strength. Now, the stronger you are, again, I've said, like the more resilient you're likely to be when it comes to reducing injuries, dealing with contact, physically exerting yourself and moving and influencing an opponent, applying force to external objects, all very, very useful. What I want you to do with your strength training, and we've talked about the potential detriments of kind of outweighing your overall training program with too much strength and not enough speed, is you can balance this with contrast training. So you can add in, like, let's say you're going to squat, you could then go and do some box jumps and vertical jumps. If you're going to deadlift, you might then go into a lighter weight kettlebell swing. So you're applying high strength, high effort movements that are traditionally going to be quite slow, like a squat or a deadlift. Like if you think, like if you're on your 1 rep max deadlift and you're trying to push up, that rep might take you 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds, maybe even longer. That is a slow movement. You can then go and contrast that with some box jumps or vertical jumps or broad jumps, very, very fast. You're looking at the opposite end of the scale. We're working both ends of that strength speed curve to move everything in an upward direction. So the other aspect that I quite like as well is including fast lifts, fast training exercises. So things like if you have the ability, if you can weightlift, if you can kind of power clean, if you can perform a jerk, if you can perform a snatch, and those kind of high skill movements, cool, include those in your program. And then even further down the end towards speed, if you can just literally get the ball on the floor like a medicine ball, like a 10-kilo sand ball or something like that, drop down to it, sling it up over your head as high as possible to mimic that kind of vertical jump, triple extension, driving the hips through, extending the knees, extending the ankles. That's a really, really nice little simple technique of weight jumping, which is essentially weight lifting. And I'll throw this one in there as well. Another really good one. You could go from a heavy, heavy sled push, like a 10-meter sled drive with a load of weight on it, and then very, very quickly just pop out to the side and accelerate into like a 20 or 30-meter distance if your space allows it. Obviously, I've already said about commercial gyms don't necessarily accommodate for those kind of exercises, so it can be quite tricky. Now, I appreciate I've gone over quite a few things and I've glossed over some of those quite quickly there because I do have to get running. And I said I'd keep it fairly short. What I want you to do, have a think about how you can apply these things to your own training. If indeed you are struggling or you're not sure what specific components are applicable to you, send me a message, get in touch with me, and I will respond. I'll let you know, and we'll have a little chat and discussion about how you can move your training forwards. Hope this has been helpful for you. In the next episode, I'm going to be talking about what do I think a semi-pro footballer should focus on in season. So if indeed that is of interest to you, make sure you tune in for that one, and I'll see you there. Take care, guys. Train hard.